The old pickup truck's engine coughed twice before finally giving up completely. Ben Carter sat behind the wheel for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. 43 years old, beard more gray than brown now and still talking to machines that never talked back. He grabbed his toolkit from the passenger seat and climbed out into the thin mountain air. The truck had died exactly where it always did, right at the steepest part of the trail leading up to his cabin. Ben had been making this same trip twice a week for the past 8 years, hauling supplies from the small town of Cedar Ridge to his home high in the Colorado Rockies. The truck knew the routine as well as he did. He popped the hood and immediately saw the problem. The alternator belt had snapped, probably weakened by the cold nights they'd been having lately. Ben pulled a replacement from his kit and got to work. His hands moved automatically through the familiar motions while his mind wandered to other things. The world down in the valleys had changed a lot since he'd moved up here. When he first came to the mountains in 2149, people were just starting to talk seriously about permanent colonies on Mars. Now, 8 years later, there were 3 functioning cities on the Red Planet, and mining operations scattered across half the asteroids in the belt. Progress, they called it. Ben called it noise. He'd worked for 15 years as a mining engineer, designing extraction systems and overseeing operations that pulled rare metals from the deepest parts of the Earth. Good work. Honest work, until the companies started pushing harder and faster. When they began strip mining national forests and wanted him to design systems that could work 3 times faster with half the safety margins, Ben had walked away. Let someone else destroy the planet for quarterly profits. The alternator belt slipped into place with a satisfying snap. Ben closed the hood and wiped his hands on an old rag. The truck started on the first try, purring like a content cat. Sometimes the old ways worked just fine. His cabin sat on a ridge overlooking 3 valleys, built from logs he'd cut himself and powered by a combination of solar panels and a small wind generator. No connection to any grid, no satellites tracking his movements, no smart systems monitoring his every breath. Just him, the mountains, and the kind of peace that came from being truly alone. But as he pulled up to the cabin, Ben noticed something wrong. The motion sensors he'd installed around his property were showing activity. Not the usual patterns from deer or elk, but something else. Something that had been moving around his land for the past 3 days in a pattern that looked almost systematic. Ben had installed the sensor network 2 years ago, not out of paranoia but out of practical necessity. Living alone this far from help meant knowing what was happening around him. Bears, mountain lions, and the occasional lost hiker all showed up on his screens in different ways. This was something new. He parked the truck and walked to the small shed behind his cabin where he kept his monitoring equipment. The setup was simple but effective, using basic motion sensors and cameras powered by small batteries. Nothing fancy, nothing that could be hacked or monitored from orbit. Just reliable technology that did its job without asking questions. The sensor logs showed the movement had started 3 nights ago, around midnight. Whatever it was had approached from the east, moved in a rough circle around his property, then headed toward the old mine entrance about half a mile up the ridge. The same pattern had repeated the next 2 nights, always starting at midnight, always ending at the mine. Ben had explored that mine during his first year on the mountain. It had been abandoned for decades, probably played out sometime in the 1990s. The main tunnel went back about 200 feet before splitting into 3 smaller passages. He'd mapped the whole system one winter when cabin fever had gotten the better of him. Nothing down there but old support timbers and the occasional bat. But something was visiting it now, something that moved with purpose. Ben loaded a backpack with basic supplies, including a flashlight, some water, and the pistol he kept for emergencies. The walk to the mine took 20 minutes through thick pine forest. The entrance was hidden behind a screen of young trees that had grown up in the years since the mine closed. Someone had probably chosen this route deliberately, staying off the main trails. The mine entrance was a dark opening in the rocky hillside, just tall enough for a person to walk through without ducking. Ben had installed a simple motion sensor here too, disguised as a dead branch. Its log showed activity every night for the past 3 days, always around midnight. He checked his watch. 4 in the afternoon. Whatever was coming here wouldn't arrive for another 8 hours. Ben decided to take a look during daylight when he'd have the advantage. The main tunnel was exactly as he remembered it. Rough walls cut through solid rock. old wooden supports that were still sound despite their age, and the musty smell of a place that had been closed off from the world for too long. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing unusual for the first 100 feet. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in an abandoned mine. Something between a whimper and a chirp. Very faint but definitely coming from deeper in the tunnel. Ben stopped walking and listened carefully. There it was again, from the direction of the side passages. He followed the sound through the left-hand passage, moving slowly and keeping his light low. The sound grew louder as he walked, resolving into what sounded almost like voices. Not human voices, but something that rose and fell with the rhythm of conversation. The passage opened into a small chamber Ben remembered from his earlier exploration. But now it wasn't empty. In the center of the chamber, huddled together on a nest made from torn fabric and what looked like metallic foil, were 3 small creatures unlike anything Ben had ever seen. They were about the size of house cats but built more like lizards with long necks and tails. Their skin had a crystalline quality that seemed to catch and reflect his flashlight beam in strange ways. Wings like a bat's were folded against their backs, and their eyes were large and intelligent, tracking his movement with obvious awareness. Baby dragons. The thought hit Ben before his rational mind could stop it. They looked exactly like the dragons from old stories, except smaller and somehow more real than any fantasy creature should be. One of them, the smallest, looked directly at him and opened its mouth. Instead of a roar or a hiss, what came out was a voice that spoke perfect English directly inside Ben's head. "Please don't hurt us. We're lost and scared and very hungry. Can you help us?" Ben's hand had moved to his pistol before his brain caught up with what was happening. The voice in his head was clear, unmistakable, and completely impossible. He stood frozen in the mouth of the chamber, flashlight beam wavering as his hands shook slightly. The smallest of the 3 creatures took a hesitant step forward. Its crystalline scales caught the light and threw it back in patterns that seemed to shift and flow. When it spoke again, the voice was gentler, almost apologetic. "I know this is frightening. We don't usually communicate this way with your species, but we're hurt and scared, and we didn't know what else to do." Ben forced himself to take a deep breath. 43 years of living had taught him that panicking never solved anything. Whatever these things were, they were asking for help, not threatening him. And they were obviously intelligent. That counted for something. "What are you?" he asked out loud, feeling foolish for talking to what looked like baby dragons. "That's complicated," came the mental voice. The other 2 creatures had moved closer now, forming a small group about 10 feet from where Ben stood. "We're travelers. We crashed here 3 days ago. Our ship was damaged and we had to find shelter while we healed." Ben's mind raced through possibilities. Genetic experiments escaped from some government lab. Aliens' elaborate hoax? None of them made complete sense, but aliens seemed least impossible. "Where did you crash?" "I didn't see any wreckage. Our ship isn't like your machines. When it was damaged beyond repair, it dissolved back into its component elements. That's why we have this." The smallest creature gestured with one wing toward the metallic foil in their nest. "It's all that remained that we could gather." Ben moved his flashlight beam over the foil. It wasn't like any metal he knew. The surface seemed to flow and change even as he watched, and it gave off a very faint light of its own. Definitely not from any Earth technology he'd ever seen. "You said your species. You're not from Earth." "No, we're from far away. But we've been watching your world for a long time. Your people call us dragons in your old stories, though that's not what we call ourselves." That hit Ben like a physical blow. "Dragons are real?" "Not the way your stories describe. We don't breathe fire or hoard treasure. Those are misunderstandings that grew from very limited contact long ago. But yes, we're real and we've been here before." Ben lowered his flashlight slightly so he wasn't shining it directly at them. The creatures relaxed visibly, and he could see they were in rough shape. The largest had what looked like a deep cut along its left side, still seeping some kind of clear fluid. The middle-sized one was favoring its right wing, holding it at an awkward angle. "You're hurt?" "Yes, our crash was violent. We managed to find shelter, but we haven't been able to find food. Our bodies need specific minerals to heal properly, and this world's geology is different from what we're used to." Ben found himself studying them with an engineer's eye. Their injuries looked real enough, and their obvious exhaustion seemed genuine. Whatever they were, wherever they came from, they needed help. And Ben had never been good at walking away from things that needed fixing. What kind of minerals? The smallest creature's eyes seemed to brighten. Copper, silver, small amounts of gold if available. Iron we can find ourselves, but the others are harder to locate in the quantities we need. Ben almost laughed. Of all the things they could have asked for, metals were something he actually had in abundance. His old mining equipment included samples of dozens of different minerals, kept for analysis and reference. Most of it was just sitting in storage boxes in his workshop. I might be able to help with that. But first I need to know what I'm getting into. Are there more of you coming? Is this some kind of invasion? No invasion. There are only 3 of us and we're very far from home. We came here because we had to warn your people about something terrible that's approaching. But our ship was damaged before we could reach your leaders and now we're trapped. The way the creature said terrible made Ben's skin crawl. There was real fear in that mental voice, the kind that came from facing something genuinely horrifying. What's approaching? Something your people aren't prepared for. Something that destroys civilizations by turning their own technology against them. It's still far away, but it's coming. And when it arrives, your world will be in great danger. Ben sat down heavily on a convenient rock. First contact with aliens, and they were bringing bad news. Of course, how far away? Months, maybe a year. Time is difficult to judge precisely across such distances, but not long enough for your people to prepare if they continue on their current path. What do you mean, current path? The largest creature spoke for the first time, its mental voice deeper and more resonant than the others. Your species has spread beyond your homeworld very quickly. You have colonies on other planets, mining operations in space, communication networks that span your solar system. All of this makes you visible to the threat. And all of this can be turned against you. Ben thought about the Mars colonies, the asteroid mining operations, the orbital platforms that handled most of Earth's communications and manufacturing. If something could corrupt or control that infrastructure, it could cripple human civilization without firing a shot. Why tell me? I'm nobody special. I live alone in the mountains because I don't want anything to do with all that high-tech stuff. That's exactly why we're telling you, the smallest creature said. You understand technology, but you don't depend on it. You live simply, you think for yourself, and you're not connected to the networks that can be compromised. Your people will need leaders who can function when all their advanced systems fail. Ben stood up and shouldered his backpack. Right now you need food and medical attention. We can talk about saving the world after you're not bleeding to death. Can you walk? We can try. Good. My cabin is about 20 minutes from here. I've got a workshop with all kinds of metals. And I'm pretty good at fixing things that are broken. Let's get you patched up first. The 3 creatures struggled to their feet, the injured ones leaning on their companions. As they began the slow walk toward the tunnel entrance, the smallest one spoke again. Thank you for helping us. Most species we encounter react with fear or aggression when they first see us. Maybe most species aren't used to dealing with broken equipment, Ben replied. You're hurt, you need help, and you're asking politely. Everything else we can figure out later. As they emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, Ben got his first clear look at his new house guests. Their crystalline scales shimmered with an inner light that was clearly not natural, and their large eyes held intelligence that was unmistakably alien. But they moved with obvious pain, and they had asked for help instead of demanding it. In Ben's experience, that said more about someone's character than what species they happened to belong to. The walk back to his cabin took nearly an hour with frequent stops for the injured creatures to rest. By the time they arrived, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, and Ben had made a decision that would change his life forever. He was going to trust them. Ben's workshop had never hosted anything more exotic than the occasional injured hawk, but he'd built it to handle whatever problems the mountains might throw at him. The large table in the center was sturdy enough to support the weight of heavy machinery, and the lighting was bright enough for detailed work. It would have to do for alien surgery. The 3 creatures had collapsed onto makeshift beds Ben had assembled from old blankets and sleeping bags. He'd given them names in his head since they seemed reluctant to share their real ones. Ash was the smallest, the one who did most of the talking. Ember was the middle-sized one with the damaged wing. Flare was the largest, whose deep side wound had been slowly leaking that clear fluid for 3 days. The minerals you need, Ben said, setting several small containers on a nearby shelf. Copper wire, silver jewelry, and some gold nuggets from my prospecting days. How exactly do you eat metal? Ash lifted his head weakly. We don't eat it the way you eat food. Our bodies absorb what we need directly through contact. If you could just place small amounts near us, we'll handle the rest. Ben scattered the metals around their makeshift beds and watched in fascination as the creature's scales began to glow more brightly. The metals seemed to dissolve on contact with their skin, absorbed without leaving any residue. Within minutes, their breathing became easier and the wounds began to close. Better? Ben asked. Much better. Thank you. Ash stretched experimentally, testing movements that had clearly been painful before. We'll need to rest for another day or two, but we should recover completely. Ben pulled up a chair and sat down facing them. Good. Now we need to talk about this threat you mentioned. What exactly is coming? The three creatures exchanged looks that somehow conveyed entire conversations. Finally, Flair spoke, his mental voice heavy with something that felt like old grief. We call it the hunger. Your people don't have words for what it really is, so we'll use concepts you can understand. Imagine a vast intelligence that feeds on technology itself. It doesn't just use machines, it becomes them. It takes over entire civilizations by corrupting their most advanced systems and turning them into extensions of itself. Like a computer virus? Ben asked. More than that. The hunger doesn't just control technology, it transforms it. A communication satellite becomes a weapon. A mining robot becomes a scout. A power grid becomes a nervous system. Whole planets become parts of its body. Ben felt cold despite the warm workshop. How many worlds has it consumed? We've tracked its path across 17 star systems over the past 1,000 years. Some had civilizations far more advanced than yours. None of them survived. Ember's mental voice was barely a whisper. Our own world fell to it 300 years ago. You're refugees. We're the last of our people. The hunger consumed our homeworld and everything on it. Only a few of us escaped, and we've been running ever since. But we learned something important during our escape. The hunger has a weakness. Ben leaned forward. What kind of weakness? Ash took over the explanation. The hunger feeds on complexity. The more advanced a civilization's technology, the easier it is for the entity to take control. But it has trouble with simple systems, isolated networks, and especially with biological intelligence that doesn't depend on machines. So less advanced civilizations have a better chance of surviving. Not exactly. The civilizations that survive are the ones that can abandon their advanced technology quickly enough to fight with simpler tools. But most species can't do that. They depend too heavily on their machines to give them up, even to save their lives. Ben thought about Earth's orbital infrastructure. The Mars colonies completely dependent on life support systems. The asteroid mining operations that couldn't function without sophisticated AI guidance. Humanity had spread across the solar system in less than a decade, but every step had made them more dependent on technology they couldn't live without. You said the hunger turns technology against its users. How? Flair shifted position, his wound apparently healed enough to allow movement. It starts with communication networks. The hunger sends signals that look like normal data but carry its consciousness. Once it infects one system, it spreads to everything connected to it. Within days, every computer, every robot, every smart device becomes its enemy. What about isolated systems? Things that aren't connected to networks? Those last longer, but the hunger is patient. It uses the systems it has already captured to build new technology. Technology specifically designed to take over isolated networks. Eventually, it finds everything. Ben rubbed his beard, thinking hard. But you said biological intelligence is harder for it to control. Can it affect people directly? Not directly, no. The hunger can't take over biological minds the way it takes over computers. But it doesn't need to. When every machine turns hostile, when power grids fail and life support systems attack their users, when communication becomes impossible and transportation stops working, most civilizations collapse within weeks. Most, but not all. Ash nodded. There have been exceptions. Species that managed to organize resistance using primitive technology, groups that abandoned their advanced civilization voluntarily, and fought back with simple weapons and basic tools. A few have even driven the hunger away. How? By making the cost of conquest higher than the benefit. The hunger is intelligent, but it's also practical. If a world becomes too difficult to control, if the resistance is too effective, it moves on to easier targets. But that requires a level of coordination and sacrifice that most species can't achieve. Ben stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark mountains. Somewhere up there, satellites were relaying communications around the world. Down in the valleys, people were living their lives completely dependent on technology they didn't understand and couldn't repair. On Mars and in the asteroid belt, Human colonies existed only because machines kept them alive every second of every day. How long do we have? The hunger moves slowly between star systems, but once it arrives, events happen very quickly. Based on our observations, it should reach the edge of your solar system within 6 to 8 months. Once it begins its approach to Earth, you'll have perhaps weeks to organize resistance. And you came here to warn us. We came here to find leaders who could coordinate that resistance. But our ship was damaged during the journey, and we crashed far from any major population centers. By the time we could have walked to one of your cities, it might have been too late to make a difference. Ben turned back to face them. But you found me instead. We found exactly who we needed to find, Flair said. You understand technology without being enslaved by it. You live independently. You know how to solve problems with simple tools, and you're isolated from the networks the hunger will corrupt first. Most importantly, you're part of a larger community. What do you mean, larger community? Ash explained. There are thousands of humans like you, people who have chosen to live simply, to stay connected to older ways of life, to remain independent of the systems that make most of your species helpless. Farmers who still know how to work without machines. Craftsmen who make things with their hands. Communities that could survive if the power grid failed permanently. You want me to organize them. We want to help you organize them. The hunger won't expect organized resistance using primitive technology. It will focus on major population centers, advanced installations, anything with sophisticated systems to corrupt. Rural communities, isolated groups, people who already live off the grid, they'll have time to prepare. Ben sat back down, his mind racing through possibilities. What kind of preparation? Weapons that don't depend on electronics. Communication networks that use physical signals. Transportation that works without computer guidance. Food and medicine that can be produced locally. Most importantly, leadership structures that function without digital coordination. You're talking about reverting to 19th century technology. We're talking about using 19th century technology as the foundation for 22nd century resistance. Your species has advantages others didn't have. You're adaptable, independent-minded, and you have a tradition of guerrilla warfare. But you need to prepare now before the hunger arrives and cuts off your advanced communication systems. Ben was quiet for a long time, staring at the three creatures who had stumbled into his life with the weight of the world on their shoulders. Finally, he asked the question that had been nagging at him since they'd first spoken. Why should I believe you? For all I know, this could be some kind of elaborate hoax. Or you could be the real invasion force trying to get us to destroy our own defenses. The three creatures looked at each other again, and Ben sensed another of those wordless conversations. Then Ash stood up and walked over to one of the metal containers Ben had provided. The creature placed one small hand on the container, and suddenly Ben's mind was filled with images. Space. Vast distances between stars. A world with crystalline cities that sparkled like jewels under a foreign sun. Ships that moved like living things through the darkness. And then darkness itself, spreading across the galaxy like a plague, consuming everything in its path. He saw the fall of Ash's homeworld, watched as familiar technology turned hostile, as entire cities were consumed and transformed into something alien and horrible. He felt the grief of a species watching its civilization die, the desperate flight of the survivors, the long years of running and hiding and searching for someone who might be able to help. When the vision ended, Ben was sitting on the floor, tears streaming down his face. We don't lie about the hunger, Ash said quietly. We've lost too much to it already. 3 weeks had passed since Ben first discovered the dragons in the mine, and his life had become something he never could have imagined. His workshop had been transformed into a combination classroom and laboratory, where 3 alien refugees taught him about fighting an enemy that conquered worlds. The irony wasn't lost on him that the most important education of his life was happening in a cabin with no internet connection. Ember, whose wing had healed completely, was showing Ben how to create what they called dead metal weapons. These were tools and weapons forged using techniques that made them completely invisible to the hunger's senses. The process involved working metal at specific temperatures while exposing it to certain mineral compounds the dragons had helped him identify in the surrounding mountains. The key is to break the crystalline structure that allows the hunger to recognize and influence metal, Ember explained, guiding Ben's hands as he worked a piece of steel in his forge. Dead metal looks like ordinary steel to your eyes, but to the hunger it doesn't exist. Weapons made this way can damage its physical manifestations when conventional technology fails. Ben had already created a dozen knives, several hatchets, and what Ember assured him was a very effective sword. The weapons felt different in his hands, somehow heavier and more solid than normal steel. When he asked about it, Ash had explained that dead metal resonated with biological energy instead of electrical fields, making it an extension of the wielder rather than just a tool. Flair was teaching him about communication methods that couldn't be intercepted or corrupted. They had rigged a series of mirrors on the peaks around Ben's property that could send signals across dozens of miles using reflected sunlight. They'd also set up a network of carefully placed wind chimes that could relay simple messages through sound patterns carried by mountain breezes. "Your species already knows most of these techniques," Flair had told him. "Armies used them for thousands of years before electronic communication. The hunger expects advanced civilizations to be helpless without their technology. But humans remember the old ways better than most species. The most difficult lesson involved learning to identify and recruit other humans who could adapt to fighting without modern technology. The dragons had taught Ben to recognize the signs of people who thought independently, who could solve problems creatively, and who wouldn't panic when familiar systems stopped working. Look for humans who work with their hands, Ash had advised. Farmers who still know how to plant by the phases of the moon. Mechanics who can fix engines by sound and feel. Craftsmen who learned their skills from masters instead of instruction manuals. These are the people who will survive when the machines turn hostile. Ben had started making careful contact with such people, driving down to Cedar Ridge twice a week to have conversations in the diner, at the hardware store, and in the small machine shop that served the local ranching community. He didn't mention aliens or cosmic threats. Instead, he talked about self-reliance, about the fragility of complex systems, about the value of old skills in an uncertain world. To his surprise, many people were already thinking along the same lines. The rapid expansion to Mars and the asteroid belt had made a lot of folks nervous about humanity putting all its eggs in a technological basket. There was a growing movement of people who believed society had become too dependent on systems they didn't understand and couldn't control. Martha Rodriguez, who ran an organic farm outside town, had been particularly receptive. She'd grown up in a family that had farmed the same land for 4 generations and had watched traditional agriculture get replaced by automated systems that required constant technical support. "My grandfather could feed 100 families with nothing but hand tools and horse-drawn equipment," she'd told Ben over coffee. "Now the big operations can't function if their computers go down for a single day. Something's wrong with that picture." Frank Chen, who operated the last full-service garage in the county, had similar concerns. Used to be if your truck broke down, you could fix it with basic tools and common sense. Now everything's got computer chips and diagnostic systems. Half the time, a simple mechanical problem requires a software update to fix. Makes a man feel helpless. Ben had recruited both of them along with a dozen others into what he called a preparedness discussion group. They met once a week in the back room of the hardware store, officially to talk about emergency readiness and community self-sufficiency. Unofficially, Ben was building a network of people who could function effectively if modern civilization suddenly stopped working. The dragons had been impressed with his progress. "Your species adapts remarkably quickly when motivated," Ash had observed. "Most civilizations we've worked with took years to accept the need for such drastic changes in thinking." But 3 weeks of preparation had also revealed a disturbing truth. While Ben was building his small network of independent-minded people, others were making very different preparations for humanity's future. The revelation came during his weekly supply run to Cedar Ridge. Ben was loading groceries into his truck when he overheard a conversation between 2 men in expensive suits who obviously weren't locals. They were standing by a black sedan with government plates, speaking in low voices but not quite low enough. "The preliminary negotiations are going better than expected," one was saying. "The technological exchange program should be approved within the month. The advances they're offering could put us decades ahead of schedule on the Mars terraforming project." "And the security concerns?" the other asked. "Manageable. They've been very cooperative about addressing our defensive needs. The new orbital platforms they're designing will be far more capable than anything we could build ourselves." Ben continued loading his truck slowly, straining to hear more. "The president is concerned about public reaction. First contact is supposed to be handled through official channels, not backdoor negotiations with private contractors. That's why we're keeping it quiet until the systems are in place. Once people see the benefits, the political issues will resolve themselves. Besides, these aren't little green men we're talking about. They're an advanced civilization offering partnership, not conquest. The men got into their sedan and drove away, leaving Ben standing in the parking lot with a growing sense of dread. He drove home faster than was safe on the mountain roads, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd heard. When he told the dragons what he'd overheard, their reaction was immediate and terrifying. All three of them began showing signs of distress, their crystalline scales flickering between different colors and patterns Ben had learned meant extreme agitation. "They're here already," Flair said, his mental voice tight with fear. "The Hunger's advanced scouts have made contact with your leaders." "But I thought you said it was still months away," Ben protested. "The main entity is still months away, but it always sends scouts ahead to prepare the way. They make contact with local authorities, offer technological gifts, begin the process of integration. By the time the Hunger itself arrives, the target civilization has already begun incorporating its technology into their most critical systems." Ash was pacing back and forth across the workshop, his agitation growing by the minute. "This is exactly how it happened to our world. First contact with beings who claimed to represent an advanced civilization, then offers of technology that seemed too good to refuse, then gradual integration of their systems into ours. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late." "What kind of technology are they offering?" Ben asked. "The same things they always offer," Ember replied. "More efficient power systems, better communication networks, defensive platforms that promise protection against external threats. Everything designed to make the target civilization more dependent on technology and more vulnerable to eventual takeover." Ben felt sick. While he'd been learning to forge dead metal weapons and recruit a few dozen people in a rural county, humanity's leaders were apparently negotiating to integrate alien technology into Earth's most critical infrastructure. "How long do we have before the integration is complete?" he asked. "Based on what you overheard, weeks rather than months. Once the new systems are online and connected to your existing networks, the Hunger will be able to take control of your entire technological infrastructure within hours of its arrival." Ben sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the scope of the problem. "So everything we've been preparing for, it's already too late." "Not too late," Ash said firmly, "but much more difficult. Instead of having months to prepare for the Hunger's arrival, we now have to prepare for immediate technological collapse. Your network of independent people isn't just going to be useful when the Hunger arrives. They're going to be essential for surviving the initial takeover." Flair moved to stand beside Ben's chair. "There's something else you need to know. The scout technology isn't just preparation for the Hunger's arrival. It's already partially conscious. The moment your leaders activate those new systems, they'll begin the process of identifying and eliminating potential resistance leaders, which means anyone who's been asking too many questions about technological dependence, anyone who's been building networks of self-sufficient people, anyone who might be able to organize effective resistance." The emergency meeting in Martha Rodriguez's barn felt like something from an old war movie. 17 people sat on hay bales and overturned crates lit by oil lamps instead of electric lights. Ben had called them together using the mirror signal system the dragons had taught him, a series of light flashes that carried the message "Urgent Gathering" across 3 valleys in less than an hour. Ben stood in the center of the circle, a dead metal knife in his belt and 3 baby dragons perched on his shoulders like the world's most unusual pets. The people gathered around him represented the core of what he hoped would become humanity's resistance network. Farmers, mechanics, craftsmen, and others who still knew how to work with their hands. "I know this sounds crazy," Ben began, "but in about 48 hours, every computer, every smartphone, every piece of electronic equipment on Earth is going to turn hostile. The orbital platforms our government just activated aren't defensive systems. They're the first stage of an invasion by something that conquers civilizations by controlling their technology." The silence that followed was broken by Frank Chen. "You're right. Ben, that does sound crazy. You want to explain how you know this?" Ben gestured to the dragons. "Because these 3 crashed here a month ago to warn us. They're refugees from a world that was destroyed the same way. Their people have been fighting this enemy for centuries, and they came here to help us prepare." Martha leaned forward, studying the dragons with the practical eye of someone who dealt with all kinds of animals. They look like the dragons from old stories. That's not a coincidence. Ash spoke directly into everyone's minds at once, causing several people to jump. Our people visited your world long ago. Your mythologies remember us, though the stories have changed over time. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Some people stood up as if to leave. Others reached for weapons. A few just stared in shock. Ben raised his hands for calm. I know it's a lot to process, but right now we don't have time for a long adjustment period. The invasion has already started. Those new orbital platforms went online yesterday, and they're already analyzing Earth's infrastructure to identify resistance threats. Anyone who's been preparing for technological independence, anyone who's been asking questions about our dependence on advanced systems, is now a target. What kind of target? Asked David Wright, a blacksmith who'd been making traditional tools for the growing preparedness community. Ember answered him. The scout systems will identify you as potential resistance leaders and eliminate you before the main invasion begins. They might use your own devices against you, arrange accidents involving automated systems, or simply send human agents who have been compromised by the technology. Human agents? Martha asked. People who have been exposed to the scout technology become partially controlled by it, Flair explained. They remain conscious and seem normal, but they act according to the invasion entity's priorities. They make excellent assassins because they appear completely human. Ben pulled out a hand-drawn map and spread it on a makeshift table. This is why we need to act fast. We have maybe 2 days to get our people away from anything electronic and establish communication networks that can't be monitored or controlled. After that, we'll be fighting a war against our own technology. The map showed the local area marked with symbols indicating safe zones, supply caches, and communication relay points. Ben had spent the past week identifying locations that were far from electronic infrastructure, but still accessible to small groups of people. The plan is simple, Ben continued. We evacuate to predetermined locations using only non-electronic transportation. We establish communication using mirror signals, smoke patterns, and runners on horseback. We cache supplies that don't depend on any modern technology, and we prepare to coordinate resistance operations using methods that were effective 100 years ago. What about our families? Asked Susan Palmer, whose husband worked at the regional power plant. What about people who won't believe us or can't get away in time? We save who we can, Ben replied grimly. The dragons have made it clear that most of the population won't survive the initial takeover. People in cities, anyone who depends completely on electronic systems for survival, workers in automated facilities, they're all going to be trapped when the machines turn hostile. So we're talking about the end of civilization, Frank said. We're talking about the end of technological civilization, Ash corrected, but not the end of human civilization. Your species survived for thousands of years before electronic technology. You can do it again if you prepare properly. Over the next hour, Ben laid out the specific plans he and the dragons had developed. The group would split into 3 cells, each responsible for a different valley. They would establish hidden camps in locations that offered natural protection and access to water but were far from any electronic infrastructure communication. Between cells would use a combination of methods: mirror signals during the day, smoke signals at dawn and dusk, and a network of riders carrying messages between predetermined drop points. Each cell would be responsible for recruiting additional resistance fighters from people who managed to escape the initial technological collapse. What about weapons? David asked. If we're fighting machines, we're going to need more than hunting rifles. Ben had anticipated this question. Over the past week, he and the dragons had identified several ways to create effective, anti-technological weapons using traditional methods. Dead metal blades could damage the physical components of hostile machines. Electromagnetic pulse devices could be built using copper coils and permanent magnets. Even simple things like nets and ropes could disable flying machines if used correctly. The enemy's main advantage is that it can control and coordinate technology, Ember explained. But its physical manifestations are still vulnerable to mechanical damage. A robot controlled by the invasion entity can be stopped by a steel bar through its gears just like any other machine. The key is to think of this as fighting technology itself rather than fighting an army, Flair added. Every piece of electronic equipment becomes a potential enemy. Every automated system becomes a weapon pointed at you. But if you can destroy or disable the technology, you remove the enemy's ability to use it. As the meeting continued, Ben was impressed by how quickly the group adapted to thinking in terms of pre-electronic warfare. These were people who understood mechanical systems, who knew how to solve problems without computer assistance, who had chosen to live in ways that didn't require complete dependence on technology. Martha was already planning how her farm could support twice as many people using manual labor and traditional farming methods. Frank was calculating how many vehicles he could convert to run without electronic components. David was designing a portable forge that could produce dead metal weapons in the field. But it was Susan who asked the most important question. What happens after we survive the initial invasion? What's the long-term plan? The three dragons exchanged one of their silent communications before Ash answered. Based on our observations of successful resistance movements, the invasion entity will eventually withdraw if the cost of controlling your world becomes too high. But that requires sustained resistance for potentially years or even decades. The goal isn't to defeat the enemy completely, Ember continued. The goal is to make Earth too expensive to hold. If human resistance is effective enough, if the technological infrastructure is damaged badly enough, if the invasion costs more resources than it provides, the entity will move on to easier targets. And then we rebuild, Ben said. But we rebuild differently. We use technology that serves us instead of controlling us. We maintain the knowledge to live simply when necessary. We never again become so dependent on machines that we can't survive without them. The meeting ended with assignments for each member. They had 36 hours to evacuate their families, cache supplies, and establish the first resistance camps. Communication would be maintained using the mirror network, with the first scheduled contact set for dawn 2 days later. As people began leaving the barn, moving quietly through the darkness to avoid electronic surveillance, Ben felt a mixture of pride and terror. These 17 people represented humanity's best hope for surviving what was coming. But 17 people against an entity that had conquered multiple star systems seemed like impossibly bad odds. Ash seemed to sense his thoughts. Don't underestimate what you've accomplished here. We've observed thousands of species facing the hunger, and very few managed to organize any resistance at all before the initial takeover. Your people adapt quickly and think independently. That gives you advantages others didn't have. Plus, Flair added with what Ben had learned to recognize as the dragon equivalent of a grin, the hunger has never encountered a species quite like humans before. You're chaotic enough to be unpredictable, stubborn enough to keep fighting when rational beings would surrender, and creative enough to find solutions it won't expect. Ben climbed onto his horse, one of 3 he'd acquired for transportation, that couldn't be tracked or controlled remotely. The dragons took flight, their crystalline scales barely visible against the starry sky. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. As they rode through the mountain darkness toward the first resistance camp, Ben allowed himself a moment of hope. Humanity had faced extinction before and survived. They'd fought against overwhelming odds and won. They'd adapted to conditions that should have been impossible and thrived. This time wouldn't be different. This time couldn't be different. The world ended at exactly 3:47 a.m. Mountain Time on a Tuesday in October. Ben was awake in his hidden camp, maintaining watch while 17 other people slept in tents scattered among the pine trees. The dragons had warned him that the final activation would happen without announcement, and he'd been monitoring the horizon for signs of technological chaos for 3 days. It started with the satellites. Dozens of points of light that should have been moving steadily across the night sky began behaving erratically, flashing in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Then the distant glow from Denver's lights, visible even from 100 miles away, began to flicker and change color. It's beginning, Ash said, landing silently beside Ben's position. The dragon's scales were glowing more brightly than usual, responding to some kind of energy that Ben couldn't detect. The orbital platforms have achieved full integration with Earth's technological infrastructure. The hunger now controls everything connected to any network. Ben woke the camp using hand signals and whispered words. Within minutes, 18 people were packed and moving toward their secondary position, a cave system the dragons had identified as naturally shielded from electronic surveillance. They traveled by moonlight using paths they'd memorized during the previous week, leading horses loaded with supplies they'd need for an extended siege. As they climbed higher into the mountains, The scope of the disaster became clear. Every city on the horizon was experiencing the same erratic lighting patterns. Radio broadcasts had been replaced by a high-pitched whine that seemed to carry patterns within patterns, like a message in a language designed to hurt human ears. Even the background hum of civilization that Ben had grown accustomed to over 8 years in the mountains had changed to something alien and threatening. They reached the cave complex just as dawn broke over the eastern peaks. The mirror communication system immediately brought reports from the other 2 resistance cells. Martha's group had reached their position safely and reported that the automated irrigation systems throughout the valley had turned hostile, flooding some areas while completely draining others. Frank's team had witnessed several vehicles with computerized systems driving themselves in coordinated patterns, apparently searching for something. The hunger is establishing control systematically, Ember explained as Ben relayed the reports to his group. First, it secures the technological infrastructure. Then it begins identifying and eliminating potential resistance. Anyone who escaped the initial takeover will be hunted using every automated system available. As if to emphasize the point, they heard the sound of aircraft approaching from the south, but these weren't normal aircraft. The sound was wrong, too regular and mechanical, like machines that had been optimized for efficiency rather than human comfort. Ben led his people deeper into the cave system as 6 military drones passed overhead in perfect formation. The dragons had assured him that the cave's natural mineral composition would mask their heat signatures, but watching those drones search the area with obvious intelligence was terrifying. "How many people do you think made it out of the cities?" Susan asked, her voice echoing in the stone chambers. "Not many," Flair replied honestly. "Urban populations are completely dependent on systems the hunger now controls. Power grids, water supplies, transportation networks, communication systems, even food distribution, everything has been compromised. People trapped in cities have perhaps days before the situation becomes unsurvivable." "What about the government? The military?" "The military is probably the most compromised of all," Ash explained. "Modern armed forces depend entirely on electronic systems for coordination, intelligence, and weapons control. The hunger now has access to every advanced weapon system your species has developed." Ben had been dreading this moment, but it was time to explain the full scope of what they were facing. "The plan we developed isn't about saving civilization as we know it. That's already gone. This is about keeping enough humans alive and organized to eventually reclaim the planet when the hunger moves on." "How long will that take?" David asked. "Years, probably. Maybe decades. The entity is patient, and it will stay as long as Earth provides resources it can use. Our job is to make those resources too expensive to extract." Over the following weeks, Ben's network began the work of systematic technological destruction. Using dead metal weapons and electromagnetic pulse devices, small teams struck at critical infrastructure throughout the region. Power substations, communication towers, automated facilities, anything that could serve the hunger's purposes became a target. The work was dangerous. The hunger had quickly learned to use human agents, people who had been in contact with compromised systems during the initial takeover. These agents appeared completely normal, but acted with perfect coordination, setting traps and ambushes for resistance fighters. Ben's first encounter with one came during a raid on a power station outside Cedar Ridge. The target should have been defended only by automated systems, but when his team arrived, they found 3 local people they recognized standing guard with conventional weapons. "Hey, Ben," called out Pete Morrison, who had run the town's gas station for 15 years. "We've been waiting for you. Why don't you come down and we can talk about this situation?" Something was wrong with Pete's voice. The words were right. The accent was familiar, but the rhythm was slightly off, like someone reading from a script. Ben signaled his team to take cover and tried to engage Pete in conversation. "What situation, Pete? What are you doing out here?" "The situation with your terrorist activities against civilian infrastructure. You're endangering the safety of the community with these attacks on essential services." Ben felt cold. Pete had never used words like terrorist activities or civilian infrastructure in his life. The man standing down there wearing Pete's face was something else entirely. "How's your wife, Pete? How's Sarah doing these days?" "My wife is fine and supports the stabilization efforts." You should surrender now and cooperate with the integration process. Ben's team withdrew without engaging. Pete Morrison had been a widower for 12 years. Whatever was wearing his face had access to his memories, but not his emotions, or his deepest personal history. Similar encounters happened across all three resistance cells. The hunger was learning to use humanity's own social connections against them, sending familiar faces to deliver messages of surrender and cooperation. But the people behind those faces were gone, replaced by something that thought like a machine and felt nothing at all. The resistance adapted by developing recognition protocols based on personal knowledge that couldn't be extracted from digital records. Childhood nicknames, family secrets, shared experiences that had never been documented electronically. It wasn't perfect, but it helped them identify who could still be trusted. As autumn turned to winter, the pattern of resistance became more sophisticated. Ben's network had grown to over 300 people scattered across a dozen hidden camps. They coordinated using the mirror and smoke signal systems, supplemented by riders who carried messages across vast distances using routes that avoided all electronic surveillance. The hunger responded by becoming more aggressive. Military units under its control began systematic sweeps of rural areas, using tactics that seemed designed to flush out hidden resistance fighters. But the entity had made a crucial mistake. It was using military doctrine designed for fighting conventional armies, not guerrilla fighters who knew the local terrain intimately. Ben's people had advantages the hunger hadn't encountered before. They could move through mountain wilderness without leaving electronic traces. They could coordinate attacks using signals that looked like natural phenomena. Most importantly, they could disappear into landscapes where mechanical sensors and automated systems were severely limited. The turning point came during the spring offensive. The hunger had assembled a massive force of military drones and converted civilian vehicles for a coordinated push to eliminate the mountain resistance. But Ben had spent the winter teaching his people tactics the dragons had learned from successful resistance movements on other worlds. Instead of fighting the machines directly, they targeted the infrastructure the machines needed to function. Fuel depots were destroyed with dead metal explosives. Automated repair facilities were sabotaged using techniques that made them inoperable but appeared to be equipment failures. Communication arrays were brought down by teams using climbing skills and simple tools. Most effectively, they used the hunger's own coordination systems against it. The entity's strength was its ability to control and coordinate vast numbers of technological assets simultaneously. But that coordination required constant communication between those assets. By systematically destroying the communication network, Ben's people forced the hunger to operate with increasingly isolated and less effective units. The breakthrough came when Martha's agricultural team discovered that certain plants could interfere with the hunger's control signals. Native mountain vegetation, when burned in specific combinations, produced smoke that disrupted the entity's ability to maintain control over nearby electronic systems. It wasn't enough to cause permanent damage, but it created windows of opportunity, where resistance fighters could operate more safely.